of carbon dioxide from 40 millimeters of mercury to 45, we get a 100% increase in ventilation. So if I was to close the doors and do the same, but as I described before, but this time with carbon dioxide and increase it, you get a remarkable increase in ventilation, just with a small change in carbon dioxide. Another way of looking at it is that if you hyperventilate, you're told to put a brown paper bag over your mouth to try and reinstall normal ventilation. I don't know anyone that is an alcoholic anymore, so I don't know anyone that does have brown paper bags, but the principle is correct. And what you're trying to do, or when you hyperventilate, your respiratory system is trying to offload a lot of CO2. If you do that, what's going to happen to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your body? It's going to plummet. If it plummets, if you get a decrease in carbon dioxide or partial pressure in the body, our ventilatory drive disappears. So the brown paper bag is to take the carbon dioxide you're blowing out and put it straight back into your body so you don't lose the drive to breathe. And we sense that again using two types of chemoreceptors. One in central location in the brain itself, at the base of the brain, and there are two peripheral chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors are the big boy. They account for 70% of our change in ventilation. So they sense changes in carbon dioxide very quickly and give us a great drive, around 70%. 30% is due to peripheral chemoreceptors. They're what known as afferent impulses, so they get information, digest it, and then send that information, or that information then makes its way to the medulla oblongata, sometimes called the respiratory system, respiratory center in the brain. So it's just located at the base of the brain and at the top of the spinal cord. It's a very complex collection of neurons, and we still don't fully understand what's involved. But I'm going to give you an insight into what we do understand. So once that information from the peripheral and the central chemoreceptors gets to the respiratory center, digests that information and sends it out to cause an inspiratory response at rest. Okay, so efferent impulses then go to the respiratory muscle. When we're talking about inspiration, what is the main muscle? We use it every single breath that we take. Is the diaphragm. Okay, very important muscle. The diaphragm contracts, increases the volume, ventilation goes up, more CO2 is expelled, and the arterial partial pressure of more carbon dioxide expelled. The arterial partial pressure returns to 40 millimeters of mercury. And pH returns to normal. Okay? pH is quite important. So the effects of CO2. It is the major regulator of respiration during rest and during stress. So it is involved in telling us, our body, what to do. Did anyone see the Love film research that the university did? And they looked at carbon dioxide and oxygen uptake in humans during scary movies. Love film? No? No? Yeah, some of you did? Good. Carbon dioxide is very much involved in, as I was saying, our regulation. And when we're stressed, or when we're given some sort of stimulus, we produce a lot of carbon dioxide. And it causes us to breathe very, very rapidly. So it is a major component. And I'm going to look at that in a bit more detail. Small increases, I was saying, cause a 100% increase in ventilation. When you see... You'll see a lot of physiology shorthand in your textbooks. When you see V with respiration, it refers to volume. That's all we're referring to. So V is physiology shorthand for volume. It normally has a little dot on top of it. So just here. That's physiology shorthand for volume. And the E, rather counterintuitively, in this example, is to do with respiration. So this is called minute ventilation or pulmonary ventilation. Okay? So when you see that, that's what it is. Hypercapnia and hypocapnia come from, well, hyper and hypo. volume, small volume, hypocapnia comes from the Greek word for smoke, and in smoke we find a lot of carbon monoxide. They didn't know that in those times, carbon dioxide, and that's where it comes from. So hypercapnia means an increase in carbon dioxide. Hypo refers to a decrease in carbon dioxide. So if someone is underventilating, they would be hypocapnemia or hypocapnemic. If they're hyperventilating, they're going to be hypercapnemic. The important thing with CO2, though, unfortunately, our bodies are very, very complex. CO2 in our central chemoreceptors plays no direct part in changing ventilation. Okay? But we have a problem when it comes to central chemoreceptors in that hydrogen ions, or protons as sometimes they're referred to, which we produce at the end of an anaerobic event, which Jack rightly said at the back that it's involved in lactic acid. So when we produce lactic acid, the hydrogen readily dissociates from lactic acid and forms a hydrogen ion and a lactate molecule. Okay, so when you see lactic acid and lactate used interchangeably, the difference is when we dissociate lactic acid, the hydrogen ion comes off. Hydrogen ion comes off, what's that going to do to the pH of our body? It's going to decrease. Not very good for homeostasis. So we've got to get to a situation where we get rid of that hydrogen ion and restore pH. Does anyone know what happens to lactate, interestingly, after it dissociates from lactic acid? You'll refer to it as muscle fatigue, or muscle soreness, muscle stiffness, or fatigue. Is that right? Does anyone know what it actually does? It's a hugely important molecule in energy production. Not involved in fatigue in the slightest. Not even close to causing fatigue. Sorry? It does, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, something called this Corey cycle. So lactic acid is produced, hydrogen comes off, lactate. Then, if it's produced in an anaerobic muscle fibre, can cross over into an aerobic muscle fibre where it has appropriate enzymes to take it, convert it back to pyruvate. And if we convert something to pyruvate aerobically, that can then enter the Corey cycle as acetyl-CoA and be broken down. Its carbon structure can be broken down and then fed into the electron transport chain. So that's what happens to lactate. So it's not involved in fatigue in the slightest. It is a measure of fatigue, but it's not involved in fatigue. So carbon dioxide is produced. When carbon dioxide is dissolved into water, it forms what's known as carbonic acid, or air acid. Carbonic acid, and that's the H2CO3 structure you can see here. This is important for respiration and important for acid-base balance. So get your head around this. It's quite a simple process, but make sure you spend some time getting your head around it. If it forms carbonic acid at the muscle, for example, if we're exercising, it stays as carbonic acid and it's moved around to the lung. When we get around to the lung, what happens to the temperature of the gas and the pH of the gas and the amount of carbon dioxide in the gas? Carbon dioxide goes down because we're in the lung, pH goes up because we're in the lung, and the temperature goes down because we're in the lung. So it's lower than body temperature. When that happens, the carbonic acid, this item here, H2CO3, readily breaks down to hydrogen and bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is the HCO3 here. Okay? Now what does the hydrogen do from there? Decreases the pH. I'm not sure why my pH is down there. So decreases the pH. Carbon dioxide, important point here, has no direct effect on central chemoreceptors whatsoever. The other problem we have in central chemoreceptors is that hydrogen protons cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So carbon dioxide has no direct effect, and hydrogen cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. How do our central chemoreceptors sense changes in carbon dioxide and pH? And the answer I can get to it, is here. What happens is this is the blood-brain barrier, this is the cerebral spinal fluid, and that connects to a central chemoreceptors. And if you look at the top here, you can see that reaction that we just talked about playing out again. Now the hydrogen cannot cross across the blood-brain barrier, but carbon dioxide, being very water-soluble, can. Carbon dioxide crosses the blood-brain barrier, combines with water and forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid readily dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate, and the hydrogen then can combine with the central chemoreceptors and stimulate respiration. Make sense? And that's how it all plays out. The central chemoreceptors then stimulate the respiratory muscles, and we have a ventilation. Okay? So the important points from there is carbon dioxide has no direct effect on central chemoreceptors. It's facilitated by hydrogen, changes in hydrogen, protons that stimulate the central chemoreceptors, and it needs this reaction to do it. Okay? And you'll see this reaction a lot, so just get used to it and understand why it does what it does. Let's go back to a couple of interesting points. Exercise increases ventilation. It does that eventually due to oxygen debt, and it does that eventually due to lactic acid, and it does it more quickly due to carbon dioxide. But it's a little more complex than that. Within our muscle, we have a special spindle fibre that is made up of muscle and nerve fibres, and its role is in something called proprioreceptor. It's a proprioreceptor, and what it does is it senses that the muscle is moving, and it sends an impulse all the way to the initially to the motor cortex, but on going up to the motor cortex, it communicates with the respiratory zone to initiate breathing. So before changes in partial pressure, before any changes in the pH occur, the brain is already signaling to the respiratory muscle. It's saying, by the way, your muscle is